What the soul brings back to Earth that is innate within after a sojourn in Mars. Innate within means vibrations from the sojourn in Mars are deep-rooted in the soul and may be accessed and felt by the physical body through the emotions. Mars, anger, wrath, madness at times have been the experiences that have caused those temperamental influences which have arisen in the entity's experience during this particular sojourn. Thus the entity is a reasoner within self's own right, yet with the environs of Mars at times it is easily upset. We also find in Mars anger, self-indulgence, becoming at times stumbling blocks to the entity. It is true, however, that an individual who has no temper is in almost as bad a fix as one who having one does not control it. Thus we find the self oft, in the experience of the entity, causing turmoils, by the desire to rule as we shall see from the Roman-Grecian experience of the entity. In that builded, we find one of high, ennobling ideas and ideals, often tempered in Mars, through wrath, that is brought will bring, many of the experiences that have been experienced in the building of the entity's inner being to the action within the life. Upon the right side of same indicate the character or symbol of Mars. This also would be in red, but not near so red as the plume. In the change then there is found the ennobling influences in the development and the care of the offspring, yet ever is that element present in the influence of Mars, bringing those elements of contention, dissatisfaction, those of the nature that bring much distress at times to self, to others. We find in Mars the anger, the wrath, that finds its level, even as does water in its material consciousness. And as such is the mother of strife, of vice, yea, and the purifier also of that as may be assimilated in spiritual consciousness. It is the purging spirit in the experience of man in the world today, in strife, in war, in greediness, in hate, and all is a part of thy material consciousness. And that is seen in Mars, that of the changing influences, as is brought by changing in surroundings and environs, brought on either by war or of elements that deal with the shade side of life. In the influence in Mars, we find one quick to anger, and often hiding same. In Mars we find anger, rashness, the daredevil expression and activity that has been a part of the entity's experience. Though temperate, moderate in the inner self, the entity is daring in its manifestation in others' associations, that it may hide the sympathetic nature, which has been a part of the entity's experience. We find in Mars, anger. In Mars we find those of the temperamental conditions, yet, for the entity, we find one that, even though abilities are manifest, the temperamental would be rather of that as would be developed from the material standpoint than innately finding its expression, for easily does the entity flare up, but as easily has the entity been able to control self in such conditions and relations, and as easily will it continue to be, especially will that of the higher influences and the ideals be kept in the influence of developments throughout the entity's experience. Yet these very same influences in others may control many circumstances, as will arise in the entity's experience during that period, especially in the 32nd and 33rd year. Also those influences in Mars, here, are quite different in their nature from the ordinary. For, the entity controls its own temper, but oft arouses the temper of others to see their reaction. This is a characteristic of the entity that has at times caused some disputations with those of its closest associates. And yet this is a means or a manner in which the entity analyzes those with whom it comes in contact. Thus the variations, as indicated. This also gives the relationships or activities that have been experienced. And the entity's activities in the military direction, but in a certain phase of things having to do more with the supply or the ordinances of the various natures or characters in which such activities may be experienced in the Earth sojourn. The influences from Mars make one of high temper, one that rages at some very trivial matter. Yet things of great import, that would be a worry or disturbing factor to many, the body laughs at or passes over as being a non-essential for worry, or for even disagreements. Yet often does the entity find those experiences where great problems with the minor things cause dissension in the activity of the entity or body in the present. In Mars we find the executive abilities. Thus, in whatever line of endeavor the entity might engage, or in whatever activity he might undertake, the entity might, he would make a success, if he chooses to do so, and make some reverses in opinions formed. Should the entity ever marry, make those convictions such that many of those ideas, and thought to be ideals, are done away with, else such relations will bring miserable results in the experience. In Mars we find anger, wrath, and those forces that have contributed at times to the distresses, to those conditions that have been apparent in this experience. One in Mars we find excellent as to its abilities to make good in any field of activity chosen by the entity, and naturally energetic. However, the entity is one easily tempted to flare at those things at variance to the entity. We find Mars making for a very positive, active life. One that may never succeed in working for someone else. One that should choose some activity, vocation or choice of expressing self from an individual angle, or working or establishing a business or a profession working by itself. Mars brings that abundance of energies, activities rather than anger. Anger, to the entity is a fearful state. Do not let that which ye fear come upon thee. Replace same rather with patience, constancy and most of all consistency. For, consistency is a gem which few souls acquire in its interpretation or understanding in speech or in conversation with others. One that likes to be active, keeping very busy, yet by most people the entity would be called quite neglectful of those things that it ought to do, busying self with things always starting something as indicated by Mars. In Mars the overactive person, individual must be active in some direction. We find in Mars the overactivity at times, even to the extent of driving itself. We find in Mars not only the activity of those that would oppose, but also the activity of the entity in indicating within self as well as, usually to others, the sincerity of purpose of the entity. Mars, not as to anger, but as to activity. Not that the entity doesn't get mad, it does. Most often itself, however. Mars indicates the abilities to hate as well as to love. Those influences in Mars make for rather the controversy that comes into the experience of the entity, especially as to relationships regarding standards and policies that the entity may take concerning the manner in which relationships and associations may be conducted. In Mars we find the affability as well as the very active service of the entity in its associations or connections with others. These as we find are well. Most fortunate, then, are those who may count the entity as a friend. From Mars we find the urges for activity, the intenseness with which the entity gives itself to that it chooses. Not that the entity has not also a temper of its own, and holds its grudge where it thinks it should, but no one has a right to hold any grudge. Would you ask the Father to hold a grudge against thee, or do you ask forgiveness daily? Mars easy to become riled, supersensitive in many things. In Mars, though, we find the hard-headedness or stubbornness, and the natural abilities of the entity to attract those who can easily find a scrap with someone else, even though not with the entity, and yet still remain outwardly very good friends. This is something to be cultivated, not in that there are the doubts and fears, but that the entity will meet them. For, in the application of self in those activities as may be indicated, there may be brought real expression for the entity in the experiences in this earth. The influence from Mars not only makes the entity very active, but also running into disputes that don't always get out from under the entity's feet, though the entity itself may not be drawn into same. They are influences upon his mind, his activity, the things he goes about to do. One then given with much of the influences of Mars in the present plane, and should be wary of those elements, realizing that the same urge is not in the individual, the individual not having chosen the same urge, as in some of the other experiences in Earth's plane, for with the influence of Mars is that of wrath, fire, firearms, powders, explosions and riots. These the body must be wary of, should it desire to reach the mental, the development, the scope of experiences in present Earth's plane. In Mars we find the vivacity, the ability to get mad, and yet the ability also to control self, if desirable. In Mars the anger, but tending to make for an overactive body, a very active body at the age, and the experiences of the entity in the Earth. In the keeping then from the influence in Mars, as is seen from this sojourn, and this inclination toward that of destructive forces to physical body from firearms, we find in the madness of the desire would the greater destructive force be manifest, see. Why then, might it not be asked, the difference? In that the sojourn in Mars brings to many another its association or connection with warfare or strife, either within its national scope or personal scope, and many another individual who has become, earthly called, a murderer, has had a recent sojourn in Mars. Hence, why is it given for this entity that these conditions of strife, these conditions of turmoil, have been about or within the experience and environs of the entity, yet the entity as it were aside, not a part of these disputes, yet the entity being affected in material conditions, in mental opportunities, whether as to development, as to taking a rest, or even a retardment. In Mars, while anger is a part of the experience at times, the entity has control over self well in such relationships. And again we would give that one without a temper is not worth much, but one not able to control the temper is worth a great deal less. In its activities, the entity is ever busy in that having to do with economy or associations with other lands, and especially will this be true if there is the completion of physical conditions in the present and the return to that ye call civilization. But he is doing a very good job of civilizing, even though unconscious has been his part often of late. In Mars we find the energetic activities in regard to things as well as interests and associated activities. Thus, we find the entity's abilities in directing policies of organizations or groups, rather than in that direction of working in a business for itself. Mars. And there's plenty of good anger at times in the experience of this entity, and a very active individual. Those urges latent in Mars make the entity not necessarily a busybody, though it can be if it desires and mess up people's lives as well as its own. Or it can use such to straighten them out. For, as in every individual entity, there are the abilities arising that are the positive and the negative, dependent upon what an entity has done with the abilities. But Mars gives a great activity. One who will travel about much, see many strange places, experience many unusual things. We find in Mars that the entity is one that may never be called lazy, in body or mind. You have some anger, but you're not worth much without it, and remember you're worth much less if you don't control it. Mars. Anger, activity. The entity will ever be busy, with its hands, with its mind. And these need, then, more direction not in material things, but in spiritual. Those influences in Mars make for many accentuations of the mental, as well as the ability or broadness of vision. Too oft has the entity experienced that the impelling force at times was that of physical determination that would not allow self to be downed by the activities of others. Grit or get up termed by many. This an element that may be both constructive and destructive in the makeup of an individual. Woe to him who may be ruled by wrath. Woe to him who is also of such a nature as to allow the temper, or the elements that make for impulses, to be so overshadowed by that as is momentarily necessary for the activities of a life, and not grounded in truth, that arises from spiritual concepts. Give the description of the planet nearest the Earth at the present time, and its effect upon the people. That planet now fast approaching the Earth, under whose influence the Earth's mind's trend will be for the next few years, as time is known here, is Mars, who will be only 35 million miles away from the Earth in 1924. The influence will be felt as this recedes from the Earth, and those of that nature, that is, given through sojourn there, express in their lives upon the Earth, the troublesome times that will arise, only being tempered with that of those who may be, and will be, coming from those of Jupiter, Venus and Uranus, those strong ennobling forces, tempered by those of love and strength. The influences from Mars make for the tendencies for the metal, or the activities in madness or anger too at times. For the greater development for the entity in the present experience, it will be necessary that these tendencies be curbed in the activities, else these will tend to make for moroseness in the influences of the entity's experience with others, and for that contact from those of the Earth's sojourn, in which we will find there are those that were active with the entity in its associations in the Earth that made for retardments, and these must be met in a manner as to make for spiritual applications in the experience of the entity, to bring that which will not be detrimental in the present appearance. We find that Mars gives the abilities of the entity as almost a tireless worker, especially with things having to do with the mind. Don't overtax the mental self without consideration for the physical self. For these should be kept in balance or in accord. In Mars we find those tendencies to easily become riled, to easily become self-centered and have that feeling as of someone else taking advantage of self. From Mars there have been rather the aspects that have made for conditions that have at times disturbed the body. Not in wrath, but rather in indifference to conditions or things going on about the body from the mental realm, rather inclined to make for at times the consideration of material conditions, and, especially, those that analyze themselves as questionable affairs in the activities of men, groups or conditions. Hence much of the data has at times in the experience been very well, but what would others say were I to embrace or to act upon such a thought? The development in the experience has been to use will's influence in these directions, and that which has been builded in self-development in the present relationships to the mental influences by the sojourns of the entity. We find in Mars, travel, as well as anger. And a lot of this has been in thine experience and will yet be. Poor indeed is he who does not ever show anger, but worse indeed is he who cannot control it in himself. And there most fail. Though often those who flare up quickly also forgive quickly. If they remain as little children asking, seeking, living, guide thou me, O God, in the steps I take and in the words I say day by day.